Welcome back to day 6 of our Southwest road trip, and today we're going to be talking about one of 2 national parks you can find in the Lone Star State of Texas. Guadalupe Mountains National Park is a place I'd heard very little about, far less than Big Bend a few hours south, or either of the 2 national parks in New Mexico. So that sparked some intrigue as to what it was like to visit and why it's talked about so little. Well, after making my first ever visit on January 1st, 2025, I finally found the reason, and I'll tell you what, it's not the scenery or the natural beauty. As a matter of fact, this is one of the most underrated national parks I've ever visited in that department, but more on that later. Let's talk numbers. Located a little under 2 hours east of El Paso, Guadalupe Mountains National Park protects 86,367 acres of the namesake Guadalupe Mountains. I wasn't familiar with how these formed or what the history was behind them until I visited the main visitor center, where I learned that about 260 to 270 million years ago, the land that the Guadalupe Mountains sit on now was actually underwater. It was part of a large reef that was formed by algae, sponges, and other organisms that secreted lime into seawater. Eventually, the reef was exposed by mountain building uplift, which you see a lot of in West Texas. I mean, go check out my Big Bend video if you haven't already. But enough uplift had elapsed that by the time all of the sea was dried up, the Guadalupe Mountains were the largest exposed fossil reef in the world. That is precisely why this is protected as a national park, which is so important because at surface level, these just seem like any old mountains, albeit very tall ones. The park's highest point is Guadalupe Peak, the highest point in Texas at 8,751 feet. That'll be a real hot topic in our video today. But its most prominent landmark is actually El Capitan, which is just incredibly picturesque with its fascinating shape and prominence. Although this national park is fairly large, there's just about one place to go to hike, and that's the Pine Springs section of the park. That's where you have the aforementioned visitor center and the Pine Springs Trailhead, which provides access to 4 incredible hikes. Our priority was to complete the Guadalupe Peak Trail, which takes you to the summit of Texas's highest mountain across 8.1 miles round trip and 2,949 feet of elevation gain. If you've been keeping up with our trip, you'll know that we had just done Big Bend South Rim Trail one day previously, and that was by far the longest hike between these 2 weeks of travel at more than 12 miles round trip. As a result, we felt a bit discouraged going into this one as our feet and legs were still incredibly sore. But here's what I'll say about Guadalupe Peak is although it's long, it wasn't nearly as strenuous as I expected. And I know people will have varying opinions as it has a lot to do with your physique, where you're from, how often you hike, you get the point. But for us, this really wasn't so bad as long as you kept conversating to pass time. I'll always recommend you bring friends and family on hiking trips. What's awesome about the Guadalupe Peak Trail is it showcases several of the park's ecosystems, including high desert and high elevation forest. You start in a super dry area along these mountains' foothills, but as you make your way up these seemingly endless switchbacks, your views proceed to get better and better. The peaks that towered above you now look like they're at eye level, and this gives you so much perspective as to how massive and defined they are. There's 2 reasons for this. First, because of how distinct the tops of the mountains look in this park, they almost have these ripples and cliffs as you approach their summits. But 2, surrounding the Guadalupe Mountains, the corresponding landscape is nothing more than small rolling hills and expansive desert horizon. I obviously mean this in the best way, but the Guadalupe Mountains stick out like a sore thumb. After you crank through all of these switchbacks, the trail flattens out a bit and the worst is now behind you. A lot more trees begin to appear and you'll alternate between woods and great big views when they open up. The way the environment changes as this hike goes on is by far one of my favorite aspects of it. Before the final push of switchbacks to the summit, you'll come across this picturesque bridge atop a cliff. And this is one of the best parts of the hike for views as it becomes mostly panoramic. They really demonstrate the point I made earlier about how there's so many steep vertical cliffs near these mountaintops, and they complement the foreground so much when you see them up close. You also get your first glimpse of what will be your final 360-degree panorama at the top, looking out at some of the desolate badlands making up this park's surroundings. As much as they aren't very tall, they're satisfying from up here because they look like endlessly rolling hills, so definitely appreciate these different angles before conquering this last climb. Since you've been hiking for so long up to this point, this finale can be a bit challenging, but on the contrary, the views also get more and more impressive as you go. El Capitan comes into view for the first time, which is that exposed summit out in the distance with all the trees covering it, and like with the valley views, you get more and more of El Cap until reaching the top. Guadalupe Peak summit is absolutely phenomenal and way more impressive than I expected. You have the steel pyramid that highlights the summit of the mountain, which like I said earlier is 8,751 feet. That's nearly 1,000 feet higher than Emery Peak, which is the tallest mountain in Texas's other national park, Big Bend, which of course is home to the state's second most prominent mountain range, the Chisos Mountains. Distant El Capitan is also the 7th highest peak in Texas at 8,085 feet, which alone is more than 200 feet taller than Emery Peak. Speaking of which, El Cap is an absolutely spectacular feature of of these summit views, as it looks unbelievably prominent the way it shoots up vertically out of the ground. You'll see its corresponding cliffs curving around like a snake, which is just amazing, and as stated before, the sheer quantity of trees on top of it help it stand out too. To the north are some more smaller hills, as well as a white sand dune field that's protected under the national park. That's right, White Sands National Park doesn't contain the only gypsum dune field in the area. Granted, this one covers a much smaller area, and from what I hear is a lot less beautiful. But still, you can reach these by traveling on a rough, non-paved road, but it was also just a little too far out of the way for us to consider trying. Some more amazing elements of this view are the peaks to the east that are so tall and steep, as well as the mountains from all the way at the beginning of the hike, which just looks so cool from here. I was totally blown away by Guadalupe Peak and the trail as a whole. It's really the hike of this park and probably one of my favorites in a national park. This hike really killed our legs, so we took it easy for the rest of the day in preparation for another big one to follow. We spent the first few hours of it at Carlsbad Caverns National Park in New Mexico, which you can all look forward to in the next video. While we're on the topic, I don't think enough people talk about how close these national parks are to one another. It's literally a 10-minute drive to the border with New Mexico, followed by an additional 15 to Carlsbad Caverns. That makes this one of the shortest distances between national parks in the country, and that's especially impressive because they have almost nothing in common. Following our time spent up north, we then made our way back down to the Guadalupe Mountains for one last hike. I'd highly recommend this approach, as a day and a half is perfect for this park. To conclude our time in Texas, we'd be tackling the Devil's Hall Trail, which is 3.8 miles round trip with 593 feet of elevation gain. This is a much easier hike than Guadalupe Peak, but they also focus on completely different things, so I wouldn't supplement one hike in place of another. However, this is well worth doing in addition to one of the long hikes in the park because it doesn't take up too much time and it's also not very difficult. That said, for being Guadalupe Mountain's easiest trail, it's also not like the easiest thing in the world, if you get what I mean. Most of the way is a standard flat trail that takes you deep into the mountains, but once it transitions to this dried up wash, you pretty much have to create your own path until the end. I didn't think it was anything crazy difficult, but I can also imagine some older, less capable individuals struggling with it. If you can make it through though, you'll be rewarded with lots of uniqueness. Devil's Hall refers to this narrow ravine whose walls are made up of these really cool layered rocks. I was saying it kind of looked like a canyon made of little Minecraft blocks combined with a slant that gave it such a cool appearance. Pretty early on, you'll also come across these small pools, which reminded me a lot of the subway at Zion National Park, especially because we hadn't seen much water on this trip. I also loved the mountain surroundings that made you and the canyon you're in feel so small relative to its height. This is just so cool and different from what I would have expected to find here, ending in the narrowest section that looks like a slightly wider slot canyon. After this, there's a sign stating that you've reached the end of the trail, so this does act as your turnaround point, but be sure to spend some time here and appreciate this. We were lucky to be completely alone while here, which was a nice change in pace from the crowds we'd experienced at Big Bend National Park. Personally, my favorite part of this hike was still the earlier ravine sections with the pools of water, but all in all, the payoff was well worth it for not a ton of effort overall. And I definitely appreciate the variation this adds to the park, as it's not just mountains, but also small canyons and intricate rock formations. To wrap things up, Guadalupe Mountains National Park is a lot more impressive than people make it out to be. However, I get why it doesn't receive a lot of visitors. There's not much to do here. Aside from the 2 hikes we did, there's also 2 other long ones that have the same focus on mountains as the Guadalupe Peak Trail. But from what I hear, they aren't different enough to where they'd be worth doing on the same trip. This is also the rare national park I've been to that I wouldn't say is super family friendly. Almost all of the hikes are rather challenging, and even the easiest, Devil's Hall, is not a cakewalk or anything like that. With all that being said, given my expectations and what I'm looking for in a national park, Guadalupe Mountains is absolutely worth visiting. I think it's unreasonably overlooked relative to other national parks in the region.
Guadalupe Mountains was a great stop on the trip. The actual Guadalupe Peak Trail was really cool and really engaging, and to get to the high point in Texas, that was really cool. The mountains themselves are really unique kind of looking, with that gray kind of look that kind of remind you a little bit of the Tetons in some way. And overall, the park is actually really underrated. The Devil's Hall Trail adds to it quite a bit too, as that kind of adds some diversity to the park where it's not just mountain views, it has slot canyon kind of vibes to it. And overall, I think the park is vastly underrated. I think it's a really great place, and even though it doesn't have a ton to do, it still is a really good park to visit.
Thank you all so much for joining us on our first national park visit of 2025. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to go down, give it a like, and subscribe to Travel Dash for more content like this in the future. Until next time, I'll see you all very soon. Peace out, guys.